in this region. And, again, you've got religious point of view, and you've got the historian point of view looking at some of these. And you have some Armano letters, which also help out with some of the earlier situations that we were talking about. But with the Sea of Reeds, they think, perhaps that Moses and his company were able to get through there at a certain time. The Egyptians are following behind them, chasing them down. They are coming as the tide is coming in and are not able to get through the sea. Now, many of you, I don't know how many of you have been in places where the tide rises very quickly. I was on an island in Fiji, and not very far away was another island. At low tide, you could walk between the two islands. At high tide, a huge ship could go between. So, the difference in the water level was probably about almost 30 feet. So, as you look at some of those things, it's very interesting.
Is that a photo or something?
Okay. Yes. They go into the Sinai Desert. Again, the exact details are not totally clear.
Is that the ocean or is that a cliff?
The Exodus, you've got that.
I think we can keep this till Monday.
Okay, I'm going to try. Well, there's going to be some pictures that are going to be hard to see. Guys, stop talking. Today's are controversial. Moses led the people out of Egypt. There's no dates on the Egyptian side of things because they're not going to record their defeats. The Israelites were wandering in the desert for, it says, 40 years. And the religious holiday that is still practiced by the Jewish faithful today is Passover. Passover is a retelling of the story of Exodus. So when you hear that your Jewish friends are celebrating Passover, that's what this is about. The Hebrews go to the Sinai Desert. They wander for 40 years. God renews his covenant with the Hebrews during this trek. Okay, so Moses leaves his people. He goes up onto the mountain. God gives him the 10 Commandments. When you will obey God's law. Well, now the God's law is in writing. It's down. Here's the 10 things you will do. The 10 Commandments. All right? Which then is very important, obviously, a key cornerstone to the Jewish faith, a cornerstone to the Christian faith. And in Islam, they look at Moses also as a prophet, as they look at Jesus as a prophet. And they look at the 10 Commandments as important, and many of their main laws resemble things from the 10 Commandments also. Okay, but he renews his covenant. Moses and the Israelites promised to reject all other gods. They promised not to worship any other idols, which include wealth, gold, etc., okay, and to obey God's laws, which are mostly in the 10 Commandments. And God promises the Israelites a safe return to the land of Canaan. Okay? That's the promised land. With the promised land to Abraham, it's now the promised land to the followers of, they're coming out with Moses. Many of the people die before reaching Canaan, as they're going for 40 years. And notice the time period. Remember I told you to look at the time period as you're thinking of what's going on. Think of the other disruptions that are going on within the rest of the world and how all these things may be interconnected. As you look at the decline of cities and all that throughout the region. Again, we're looking at 1200. We're looking at about 1200, 1250, some time period right in that section of history, BCE. What else happens at 1200, 1250 BCE? one of the major things we talked about this year. Odysseus, the Trojan War, same time period. So we're looking at the Trojan War, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, many other things happening in the Mesopotamian region and the eastern side of the Mediterranean, 1250, 1200 BCE. You look at the interconnections of all these things, and you've got to, hopefully you'll make some connections with them. Okay, it is foretold that Moses will not be going to the promised land, that he will die before he gets there, which he does. Here's Moses getting the Ten Commandments from God, and there's actually 2 plates, but the Ten Commandments on, the story is that they're inscribed on stone. And then this is a movie, the Ten Commandments, one of the most famous movies of the Ten Commandments. There's been several about the story of Moses. The Prince of Egypt is a more modern, quote-unquote, version of some of this.
The greatest motion picture.
Yeah.
What made them spend 40 years from Egypt to Persia, like the
Well, it's wandering. They really didn't know the ways. They were a large group of people that have to supply themselves and with food, et cetera, and it was God's will that they wandered. Yeah. He wants them to, the plan was that, the struggle, having people many of the people not make it, so that you've got a second generation that are moving forward, et cetera, et cetera.
The jihad.
Okay, so the Exodus is here. You can kind of see, from the records you can kind of pull together. Okay? So you can kind of see how taking a band of people with no supplies, no source of income, no anything else, through this region, mostly desert, rocky areas, you're going to be going slow. But here, this is probably about where they start. Here's, where they may have crossed in this region here, where you're looking at the parting of the Sea of Reeds. Okay? Comes down through the Sinai Peninsula, kind of wandering back up through here, crossing back over, and eventually coming north to the north of the Dead Sea. Okay, Joshua succeeds Moses. The nation receives the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. Canaan is a harsh land with desert. It's got it's a harsh land with desert. There's rocky terrain and wilderness. And remember before when Abraham was there, we looked at the valley of Jordan as a very agriculturally rich and fertile area. It's not so much now. We're 700 years later. There's desertification that has occurred. You've got the area is hot. It's not nearly as fertile as it was. The natural resources of water and food are much more restricted. Remember, they left there because of the drought, which kind of destroyed everything. They're coming back a couple hundred years later, but things have recovered somewhat, but they're much more harsh. So for about 200 years or so, the Israelites fight with various Canaanite groups in the region for use of these limited resources. But one of their most notable and formidable opponents are the Philistines. Okay, so now we get down to what we call the Judges. And if you read the New Testament or you read the Torah, you've got section on the Judges. So, the Judges were both military leaders and judges sent by God to save the Israelites after they had defected from their promises to follow God's law. So God punishes them in the form of allowing all these neighbors to attack them. Okay? They repent, God forgives them, and he sends the judges to help them recapture what they had lost. All right. So each tribe, there's 12 tribes now, gets a judge, and that leads them through. However, there's a lack of unity. Okay? The 12 tribes are not unified. They're each kind of doing some of their own thing. They're each following, trying to fight for their own independence. And because there's such limited resources, it really challenges the time in which they can reacquire Canaan or become a unified group in Canaan. So some of the judges tried to rally Israel, get them to combine, get them to come back into some power, work together, but not to very much success. Until Deborah. Okay. Yeah, so Deborah served as a judicial and military leader of the tribes. She was greatly admired for her wisdom, and she planned an attack on one of the main Canaanite armies, not the Philistines, but one of the main Canaanite armies. And she, prayed to God. She got God's support. Again, we're looking at our information we get from the Israelites' records, right? And with God's help, they win. That's about 1050 BCE. Notice the time period. Okay? This kind of turned the tide for reunification of the tribes of Israel. The tribes sort of begin to reunite. They're working on it. It obviously doesn't happen overnight. Warfare continues with other tribes. And about 1020 BCE, the prophet and judge Samuel anoints Saul as the first king of Israel. Okay? Saul was very popular at first. He defeats the Ammonites and other Canaanite groups. He's leading them great. He tries several times, but he just can't defeat that nemesis of theirs, the Philistines. Okay? And it was rumored that he had lost favor with God, that God wasn't going to grant him that power, etc. He's losing legitimacy because he can't beat the Philistines. Okay? Notice this time period at 1020 BCE coincides with the end of the Bronze Age. Reports are at this time Israelites get iron weapons. So we're changing from bronze to iron at about this time period. And we get to David. Now David's a shepherd boy. Saul is still trying to beat the Philistines. They fought. So they come up with a deal. Okay, so let's just call this once and for all. You choose a champion, and we'll choose a champion. And whoever wins, the other one has to get out of here. Okay? Well, Saul, who's lost legitimacy, comes and wants to try. Who will fight for us? Well, when they see who the Philistines have chosen, who is Goliath, who is immense, he's enormous. He's got this great armor on. They've got these superior weapons. He can crush a single human being in one slight blow. They're totally afraid of him. And David, a shepherd boy, says, "I'll go do it." Okay. So David's this young shepherd boy. Goliath is this great, big, strong giant of a man with all he's the champion of all the fighting, wrestling weaponry for the Philistine armies. And David goes against him. He's going up with his little spear against this guy in all this big armor. And at the last minute, he takes a stone from the riverbed, puts it in his slingshot, flings it, hits Goliath in the head, knocks him over, cuts off his head. He's the victor. Yay. Yay. So the illusion, anytime you hear the illusion, of something like David and Goliath, there's a big underdog going up against a big formidable opponent, and the underdog's going to win. Okay, so when you hear somebody say it's like David and Goliath, or you hear that illusion, that's what it's referring to. Okay? So David remains loyal to Saul. Of course, he rises in the ranks very quickly. Saul gets back some of his legitimacy because they defeated the Philistines. The Philistines have to leave as they promised they would. And eventually, of course, Saul ends up dying, and so then it's okay, so what's going to happen? So in about 10,004-ish, again, the dates are always a little bit funny depending on which calendar is being used, et cetera, et cetera. David comes and he takes Saul has said he wants him to take the throne for him. But Saul has a number of children also. And so you've got a legitimacy issue. Saul's son Ishmael is recognized as the king in the north. And so, they haven't all united all the way yet. They still are but now this is a division. So they had kind of come together under Saul, but now Saul's dead, and they've got to figure out what they're going to do about it. So Ishmael kind of raises a challenge. What are you talking about, David? I am the natural birth heritage person for Saul. I should get this. But because David had been so prominent in victories and such a great war hero, etc., as he got older, he's really known as the war king. He was very accomplished after his first battle as a youth. So he takes the south. Now the north is known as Israel, and the south is known as Judah. Okay? Ishmael is assassinated. Most people say by David's will, okay? And then David takes over as a unified leader of the north and the south. The term Jew actually comes from that region, Judah. And it was the Philistines who first used it in a derogatory manner. Just as even today, because the Hebrews won, the Jews won, right? So they get to write the records. The Philistines are the terrible, brutish, barbarian, all those terms we used for before. That term still goes with us today if something is Philistine. But at the time, the Philistines would call the Hebrews, the Israelites, in the area of Judah, they would call them Jews, and they used it in a derogatory term. But that's kind of gone away, as far as just a term being used in a derogatory manner. But at the time, the Philistines, the Jews were saying, you Philistine, and the Philistines were, you Jew, those types of things. It was derogatory back and forth. Philistines has stayed. The term Jew is not. That just is describing now the Israelites that were from the area of Judah. Yeah.
So how David was known as a war hero and he killed Goliath? Isn't that against the Ten Commandments?
Wait, what did you say?
Didn't like David.
It's not.
Isn't that against
There's
the
always
Ten
that's
Commandments?
always the
Like,
big
no,
question
no.
about religious wars, isn't it? So if you're fighting for, God's will, is that okay, as opposed to your own will? That's one of the big questions that people have always about. There's probably more people that have died in the name of religion than any other cause in the world over history. Okay. So what did David do? David set up a capital in Jerusalem. So he gets his legitimacy by being a war, by military. He maintains it also by military conquest and being known to go to battle, to fight, because some of the things he did. But he also set up the capital in Jerusalem. Okay? He brings the ark, which has the covenant and the Ten Commandments and all that in it, to Jerusalem, which gives him religious legitimacy, because he builds the city, then he brings the ark to this city. This is his city. Now that gives him not only military legitimacy, but also religious legitimacy. He organizes central government. Oh, there's political legitimacy. Okay, so he's working on this pretty well. This is how he's maintaining it. And then he enlarged the boundaries of Israel and Judah, those regions of Israel and Judah, and in general brought very economic prosperity to the Israelites. Okay, so David, the man of war, secured the kingdom for the people. Solomon the wise, so David ruled for 40 years or so. Okay, and then we get Solomon the wise, who takes over in about 960-ish. And he's known as the man of peace. He was known as wise because a lot of the things of his judgments come down and they're written in the Bible. I heard some of you, when we talked about the Hammurabi, what would you do if you're, if the birth parent wanted their child back, and some of you joke, well, you'd cut him in half and all this. Well, that's sort of one of the wisest thing, to find out who really who was the real parent of the child. They come up, I want him, and he goes, well, we'll just come and have to give him to both of you. Because the person that cared most of them would rather forfeit having the child than having the child cut in two and given to each one of them. And says, no, you take them away. And so then Solomon goes, oh, well, you must be the real parent, you get the child. Okay, so, but anyway, guys, stop talking. Solomon the Wise engaged in a lot of international trade. And a lot of international trade, a lot of building, monumental building. He modernized and really developed the city of Jerusalem. He starts making the city of Jerusalem into an international center. He reorganized the state into 12 districts. So he comes into his legitimacy by birth, right? He gets his legitimacy by birthright. He's the son of David. But he maintains it by doing some of the following things. He reorganizes the state into 12 districts. Notice we had 12 tribes, now we have 12 districts, with a governor and administrator for each one that reports back to him, is responsible to him, which is a little different. Continuing that centralized government idea, but having administrators at the edges now, at the districts. Yeah.
Do you know whether the Hunger Games is based on the 12 districts?
Interesting. I never even thought about that. Yeah. See if they did that. I don't know. Okay. So imagine. Guys, stop talking. Solomon is traveling around. He's trying to make international connections. Notice the time period. For status, wealth, and international legitimacy, he starts dedicating great expenditures for these buildings, for traveling, for his retinue, for everything else. And he lived in this very lavish and, what word did I use here that I wanted? Flamboyant lifestyle. Okay, so very different from the rest of the Israelites up to this point, who had lived pretty simple lifestyle. In fact, as we look at our Greek words, almost Spartan in many cases. They came from Egypt with nothing. They live and try to just develop these resources and just enough to survive for hundreds of years. And now David builds him this great city. He gets the wealth, and his son starts spending it. Okay? He built a grand palace with great furnishings. He had ivory and a gold throne flanked by 12 lions. The temple was made of cedar wood, which we've already talked about how precious cedar wood was, and gold decoration. He had hundreds of wives and concubines. Okay? And for legitimacy, some other things he did is the king of Phoenicia, and we're going to talk about Phoenicia in a little bit. He joined Hiram, one of the great kings of Phoenicia, and he went on a trip to the Red Sea where they got gold, ivory, jewelry, and brought all that back. So he's bringing riches and things back also. He married an Egyptian princess for diplomatic reasons. He founded and fortified a number of new cities, and he absolutely lavished money on construction of the new temple to God in Jerusalem. So all this looks pretty good. However, the Israelites are having to fork up a lot of money for this. They're being taxed to death over it, and he's expecting their labor for construction. So a lot of the Israelites are starting to resent it. But he's a very powerful leader, and he's able to maintain all of this while he's doing this. However, as you can probably guess, and there's temple. I tried to get a colored picture and all that of something, but reconstruction couldn't. But you can see the cedar temple. You can see this is a rather grand temple with cedar and gold and everything. You can see the pillars inside. When we look at his kingdom, kingdom of Israel as time, expands. Look how far north it goes. When we start talking about Phoenicia next week, here's Phoenicia. This is a really good place here to see Phoenicia. Here's where the Philistines are relegated to now. This is the area the Philistines have. The rest of this is the kingdom of Israel. Okay, as David and Solomon expanded it and took over. So you've got a pretty nice sized kingdom that has been established by David, and Solomon maintains some of it. But again, Solomon is able to take care of it. However, upon his death, we're going to have some problems. He was as the son of David, got legitimacy, his charismatic personality, his bringing all this wealth and this international recognition of Israel to the international community. He was able to get away with a lot of this, but with the resentment and other things, when he dies, there's a split in leadership. Nobody can take over from him. He did not establish one of his sons as the person who will take over, or establish one as a military leader or anything like that. So we end up splitting. Take a break. When you come back, and we'll finish.
Oh, you like no brightness.
I turned it all the way down.
We have the division of the tribes again. They go back to tribes. Remember, it's been a while since they've actually been in tribes, but they kind of have never totally gone away from it. They still have their association affiliation with the tribes. Remember, those originally came from the great grandsons of Abraham, the 12 tribes. So now the 12 tribes of north break away, and the two southern tribes break away, from the two southern tribes, which were a little bit larger. Guys, stop talking. Sometimes they allied, and sometimes they battled, to fight a common foe. Other times they battled between themselves. Not a good time period. North had been, the person who took over north was also a Saul. And that he took over the area that was known as Israel. The capital was Samaria, and very much exposed to outside threats. If you look at the region of where that is, and right now it's in modern day Lebanon, Syria, Anatolia. All those areas of some very powerful leaders are kind of all congregating in that area at the time. The south is a little smaller. They stayed loyal to David, and this was actually taken over originally by another son of the original Saul. So remember, and David had been in power for about 40 years, so this guy is going to be pretty old. But Saul had this would have been one of his younger sons, so he wasn't that much older than David had been. But the south really kind of stayed small to that whole, it's where Jerusalem is, the capital is Jerusalem, and they're staying, that whole, everything that's left over from David, the city, the temple, all this kind of stuff, the wealth and all this, they're kind of staying strong there. The northern tribes go away, they don't want to deal with Jerusalem and all that expanse and all that kind of stuff, they go away. So they split. Sometimes they help each other, sometimes they don't. They are not a unified nation anymore. However, they still share their common religion and beliefs, so that doesn't go away. The internal conflicts weaken the nation. Each kingdom struggled to be free and independent. They became very open to the invasions, and they are unable to fend off the attacks. So eventually, disaster strikes, because both Israel and Judah the Assyrians come on strong. And both Israel and Judah are told they have to pay tribute to the Assyrian king to avoid being attacked. So they do that, but it's not enough. And in 725 BCE, the Assyrians invade Samaria, the capital of Israel, the northern area, and conquer that. And by 722, the whole northern kingdom was under was under their influence. Okay, so the Assyrians, they're known to be, they're from northern Mesopotamia, and we'll be looking at their kingdom, and I'll have a map that you're going to have to kind of note on this also. They ruled basically, they had an empire from about 760 to about 612. So they're 30, 40 years into their empire, not very far from when David actually took over Israel. But now Israel has weakened itself, and they're open to attack. The Assyrians are really their nearest neighbor and their largest neighbor. If you remember that diagram of if you're too close, if you're right next to another country, you're enemies, unless that's your enemy's enemies or your friend's friend. All right. So the Assyrians of northern Mesopotamia are known in the world now sort of as the Nazis of the ancient world. They were ruthless. They wanted to take over everything. They had all iron weapons and battering rams. They would come into cities. When they came in and took over a city, they would burn it down. They were extremely cruel, seeming to love the idea of torture, and many times had mass tortures where 20 to 100 people would be put in the center of a town being tortured and tortured to death, where everybody forced to watch. Part of this was to maintain and gain legitimacy. Fear. Fear was the Assyrians' probably greatest source of legitimacy, with their military might, their penchant for being cruel. They would also, when they would take over groups of people, they would kill many of the men, even the prominent women and children, and they would deport people to all different areas. So they'd sort of divide and conquer people. If one group is kind of sent here, one group sent there, one group sent there, then they're diffusing the power you might have if you were together talking about how are we going to revolt against this. So by doing that, they kept people in their service as usually slaves or low status groups of people that would be workers for them with little power. All right, they also taxed the people they conquered greatly. They scattered the 10 tribes of the north throughout their kingdom of Assyria, and took away a lot of their power. So this becomes the kingdom of Assyria. And notice again the time period. Notice New Kingdom, Egypt, ended with the Assyrian invasion. All right, so New Kingdom, Egypt ended as Assyria became most powerful. So Assyria has now become the most dominant empire that you can see, even coming in and not just taking over the Delta region of Egypt, but taking over Egypt as a whole. Okay? And it sort of is the beginning of the end of actually Egyptian rule in Egypt. Remember the Hyksos came in, but they kicked them back out again and got the bloodlines going and all that. Once Assyria comes in, the bloodlines of Egypt start changing quite a bit, and Nubia comes over, other people come over, then the Greeks come, the Persians and the Greeks come in. So, the blood of pure Egyptian kings and pharaohs starts getting pretty thin. Yeah.
You said that the Syrians took over the 10 tribes of the north, but on the map it looks as if all 12 tribes have been conquered.
They eventually get all of them.
Okay.
Okay, but they start with the 10 tribes. Obviously, you don't do it all at once.
Persian.
But yeah, so eventually this becomes the Assyrian Empire. At the time, they're coming in here. They're probably just they're coming to this section. They still have the rest to do. Again, look at the time period and the connection to Egypt and the New Kingdom. Yeah.
Was Nineveh, was that the capital of the Assyrian Empire?
I do not think, well, they had multiple capitals actually. I'm trying to see if I can see. I'm not sure if they had a single capital or not. I know they had multiple capitals. They were moving and advancing really quickly. And I don't know that they ever came under, ever proclaimed one as their main capital. Okay, good question though. Okay, so they swept in and conquered northern Israel in 722, and then moved down in the next 5 to 10 years to the rest. Now, the southern Israel did not put up the battle that northern Israel did. That's another thing with the Assyrians, is if you kind of acquiesce, you know they're coming, and you just open your doors and let them in, they don't punish you nearly as much. And so as they started moving south, they had to do less actual battling because they had dominated so much military legitimacy that people, they saw the armies coming, they just threw their hands up, opened their gates, and said, okay, you conquered us. What's next? Okay. Next was, following their rules and taxation, et cetera, putting up with anything, the type of threats that the Assyrians were noticed for. Okay, so now, in 586, let me see if I have anything else I want to say about this. Nope. In 586, we have a empire that now started over near Babylon, the Chaldeans. They're going to start, again, you look and say, okay, so I want you to kind of look at what's going on. Why did Assyria, what's the rise and what's the fall? Why are they coming and going in 100, 150, 200 years? What's going on? Okay, so the Chaldeans are known as the Neo-Babylonians, or the New Babylonians. Okay, they're from 586 to about 539. Notice this is fairly short-lived also, 50 years. They only have 50 years in power. The Syrians had about 150 years in power. But they came in and Nebuchadnezzar, it was one of their great leaders, he took control of Mesopotamia and the eastern territory of the Mediterranean. He went into Jerusalem, and the Assyrians had not destroyed that city because they opened their doors to it. So the southern Israel, unlike northern Israel, had kind of given up and just let them take over. But Nebuchadnezzar came in, and the Neo-Babylonians, and they destroyed the temple. Absolutely destroyed it. They enslaved some of the residents. They carried them off to their city in their capital city in Babylon, to again come in as workers, low-wage earners, etc. But they went as slaves, but they weren't kept necessarily as slaves, but they were kept as kind of lower status at the time. But many of the Israelites adapted and thrived in Babylon. Okay, there was some assimilation into the culture, and the Neo-Babylonians, or the Babylonians in Babylon, they had taken over some things. They brought quite a few groups in, and they allowed the groups to sort of have their own religion, some of their own cultures. They kind of came into, they kind of built areas of the city that this is the Israelites kind of lived all in one part of the city. As opposed to spreading them out and dividing them, they allowed them to live in one area together. Some of the other cultures they conquered kind of lived in other areas of the city. And the other thing that happened in Babylon was that they were allowed to have a voice, or not to go to the political meetings after a period of time, not immediately, but they're actually allowed to go to the political meeting and speak their voice about about their opinions and what should happen and how their people should be treated and what they should be gotten. They didn't have any voting rights. They never got any voting rights, and at these meetings they weren't allowed to, they didn't really have any power, but they were allowed to say what they needed and what they thought should happen, etc., for their own groups. No temples were allowed. You were allowed to practice your religion, but you weren't allowed to build any temples. And this is where the synagogues actually came in, because the synagogues were a place of gathering, of learning, of talking, and of keeping the religion alive. So as opposed to the temples, the people got together in these smaller groups and started working on, and they ended up starting the idea of synagogue. Okay. So now, 539, we have a Persian ruler called Cyrus who comes in. All right? And Cyrus comes in, he conquers all this territory now, and Persia becomes by far the largest empire ever seen in the world. He takes over everything the Assyrians had, everything the Neo-Babylonians had, takes over a lot of Greece. He goes into the European areas and takes over regions in north of Greece, and then he starts moving over, far east of the region into what we know as, they started, their heartland was in what we now know as Iran. And so they moved from that region west and north and started conquering a lot of the areas. So, so the Persians they came in, they said, you guys have been kept here, you brought as slaves, you can go back to Jerusalem if you want. But 50 years is really 2 generations, right? So it's like your grandparents had been brought over here, but you're used to this place, and a lot of people were sort of thriving. Other people wanted to leave, but they didn't necessarily want to go back to Jerusalem. They didn't know much about it. And so many chose not to return. And some people, because people were allowed to leave Babylon, which had been a place of captivity for many different people, this is a time of great migrations. So people were moving, leaving. The Israelites moved to many different regions, kind of in smaller family and tribal groups. And this is known as the diaspora. Okay, the diaspora meaning a scattering. Okay? And for the 400s then, the Jewish writings are collected and organized into what we know as the Torah, organized into that fashion now. Many other empires would dominate this region, including the Greeks and the Romans. But Jerusalem is still a very important city for the Jewish population, Christians and Muslims. Again, here is something that shows you Judah and Israel. Notice Judah goes down to the Red Sea, which is important. Here's a picture of modern-day Jerusalem.
I remember it.
And there's some common symbols. Of Judaism. All right.